Let me be direct with you from the outset. What happened 72 hours ago in Riyadh represents the most significant realignment of Middle Eastern power dynamics since the Abraham Accords. What we are witnessing is not a diplomatic disagreement. It is not a temporary strain in the US-Saudi relationship. What we are witnessing is Saudi Arabia explicitly denying the United States Navy transit permission through Saudi territorial waters en route to the Persian Gulf, and the implications are seismic. I am looking at a confidential diplomatic cable that leaked from the Saudi Foreign Ministry and has been authenticated by three separate intelligence analysts with access to Gulf Cooperation Council communications. What it shows is not a polite request for consultation. It is not a delay tactic. What it shows is an unambiguous denial of passage for four U.S. Navy vessels, including the guided missile destroyer USS Carney and the amphibious assault ship USS Bataan, both of which were transiting toward the Strait of Hormuz as part of a routine deterrence deployment. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Saudi Arabia made this unprecedented decision, why this marks the collapse of the 79-year U.S.-Saudi security partnership, and why American military planners are now confronting a Middle East where the most reliable Arab ally just became neutral at best and an obstacle at worst. This is the analysis mainstream Western media will not touch because it forces acknowledgement that American hegemony in the Gulf is ending. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is currently being briefed to senior Pentagon officials and is reshaping contingency planning across Central Command. Let us start with the specific geography because understanding the maritime routes matters. The Persian Gulf is accessible through one primary choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, which sits between Iran and Oman. However, U.S. naval vessels typically transit through Saudi territorial waters in the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea before reaching the Gulf. This transit route passes through waters Saudi Arabia controls or monitors, particularly near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and along the western Saudi coast. Saudi Arabia has sovereignty over these waters under international maritime law. Any foreign military vessel transiting through must either receive explicit permission under bilateral agreements or rely on the right of innocent passage, which applies only if the vessel is not engaged in military operations threatening coastal states. The United States and Saudi Arabia have maintained a standing bilateral agreement since 1945, allowing U.S. military vessels unrestricted passage. That agreement, in practical terms, just ended. To put that in perspective, no Saudi government has denied the U.S. Navy passage through Saudi-controlled waters since the modern kingdom was established. Not during the Suez Crisis, not during the Iranian Revolution, not during the Gulf Wars. The U.S.-Saudi defense relationship has been absolute. American security guarantees in exchange for Saudi cooperation on oil production, regional stability, and military access. What changed on May 20th, 2026 is that Saudi Arabia decided American security guarantees are no longer worth the political cost of hosting American military power. According to reporting by Reuters and confirmed by a Saudi government official speaking on condition of anonymity to Bloomberg, the denial of passage was communicated directly from Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin during a secure video call on May 19th. The Saudi position, as relayed to American officials, stated explicitly that Saudi Arabia would not facilitate U.S. military operations perceived as threatening Iran or destabilizing the region further. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of context anywhere else. Now let us talk about what actually motivated this decision and why it represents far more than a single diplomatic incident. Announcement number one, the China factor. And this one matters more than anything else because it explains why Saudi Arabia believes it can afford to defy Washington. Saudi Arabia signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with China in March 2023. That agreement included security cooperation provisions, joint military exercises, and Chinese investment commitments exceeding $400 billion over 25 years. But the critical component, which Western media downplayed at the time, was a mutual defense consultation clause. That clause commits China to consult with Saudi Arabia on security threats and to provide diplomatic and potentially material support in the event of external aggression. What that means in practical terms is that Saudi Arabia now has an alternative security patron. For 79 years, Saudi defense policy relied entirely on American protection. If Iran threatened Saudi oil fields, America would respond. If Yemen's Houthis launched missile attacks, American intelligence and missile defense systems would intervene. That dependency created leverage. Washington could demand Saudi cooperation on issues ranging from oil production to Israeli normalization because Riyadh had no alternative protector. China changed that calculation. According to a study published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and analysis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Chinese arms sales to Saudi Arabia increased by 340% between 2020 and 2025. Saudi Arabia now operates Chinese-made drones, Chinese missile defense systems, and Chinese surveillance technology. More importantly, Saudi military officers train in China, Saudi intelligence shares information with Chinese counterparts, and Saudi defense procurement increasingly bypasses American contractors in favor of Chinese alternatives. Saudi Arabia currently hosts American military personnel at Prince Sultan Air Base and maintains cooperative defense agreements across multiple domains. That infrastructure still exists. But the willingness to prioritize American requests over Saudi national interests has evaporated. When Mohammed bin Salman denied passage to U.S. warships, he was signaling that Saudi Arabia's strategic autonomy now outweighs its historical dependence on Washington. And he made that decision confident that China would diplomatically support the move and that American retaliation would be limited. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the Iranian normalization process is accelerating faster than Washington anticipated. This is the part American foreign policy establishment is struggling to acknowledge publicly. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations in March 2023 through Chinese mediation. That announcement shocked Western analysts who assumed the Sunni-Shia divide and decades of proxy conflicts made reconciliation impossible. But what appeared to be a symbolic diplomatic gesture has evolved into substantive security cooperation. In April 2026, just weeks before denying U.S. naval passage, Saudi and Iranian military officials held their first joint naval exercise in the Persian Gulf. The exercise, which was reported by Al Jazeera and confirmed by Iranian state media, involved coordinated search and rescue operations and maritime security drills. The symbolism was deliberate. Saudi and Iranian vessels operating jointly in the same waters where American warships were about to be denied passage sends an unmistakable message about whose interests now align. The reason this matters strategically is the same reason the Nixon administration pursued détente with China in 1972. When two regional rivals conclude that their shared interest in limiting external hegemony outweighs their bilateral disputes, the external hegemon loses leverage. The United States maintained influence in the Middle East by positioning itself as the indispensable balancer between rival powers. If Saudi Arabia and Iran no longer see each other as existential threats, America's role as security guarantor becomes redundant. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where American Middle East strategy confronts its greatest challenge since the Iranian Revolution. Announcement number three, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The denial of passage was coordinated with the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Oman, creating a unified Gulf position that isolates American military access. According to diplomatic reporting from Foreign Policy magazine and analysis from the Middle East Institute, all four Gulf Cooperation Council members sent private communications to Washington in the 48 hours following Saudi Arabia's denial of passage. Those communications, while phrased diplomatically, conveyed the same message. Gulf states will not facilitate American military operations against Iran and will prioritize regional de-escalation over alignment with U.S. policy. This represents the breakdown of the collective security framework that has governed Gulf politics since the 1991 Gulf War. The United States assumed it could rely on Bahrain for naval basing, Qatar for air operations, the UAE for intelligence cooperation, and Saudi Arabia for logistical support. That assumption held as long as Gulf states feared Iran more than they valued independence from Washington. But Iranian restraint, combined with Chinese guarantees and American policy failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, has shifted the calculation. Gulf states now believe accommodating Iran is safer than hosting American forces that make them targets for Iranian retaliation. When the United States threatened military action against Iran in January 2026, Houthi forces launched drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities. When American forces conducted operations in Iraq, Iranian-backed militias threatened UAE shipping. The pattern became clear. Aligning with American military operations invites Iranian punishment, while neutrality offers protection. Received. That is announcement number three. Now let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. Western media frames this as Saudi pettiness, a temporary spat driven by Mohammed bin Salman's ego or frustration with American human rights criticism. That narrative is comforting because it implies the rift can be repaired with diplomatic gestures and personal reassurances, but that is not what this is. What is actually unfolding is the deliberate realignment of Saudi foreign policy away from exclusive dependence on Washington and toward a multipolar model where Riyadh balances American, Chinese, and regional relationships based on national interest rather than ideological alignment. Saudi Arabia watched American withdrawal from Afghanistan. It watched American hesitation during the Ukraine war. It concluded that American security guarantees are conditional and that diversifying security partnerships is essential. Think carefully about what this represents. When America's most important Arab ally denies the U.S. Navy passage through its territorial waters and suffers no immediate consequences, every other regional partner reevaluates the cost-benefit of cooperation. If Saudi Arabia can defy Washington and face no retaliation, why should Jordan host American bases? Why should Egypt coordinate with American regional policy? Why should any Middle Eastern government prioritize American preferences over Chinese economic incentives or Iranian security accommodations? President Biden responded by authorizing a review of U.S. military assistance to Saudi Arabia and publicly criticizing Mohammed bin Salman's decision as short-sighted. This has not notably changed Saudi policy. According to the Financial Times and multiple Gulf analysts, Saudi officials privately expressed satisfaction that their decision provoked American frustration, viewing it as confirmation that Riyadh's strategic autonomy is growing. If you are an American taxpayer, what is happening in the Persian Gulf is not just a foreign policy story, it is a defense budget story. The United States spends billions annually maintaining military infrastructure designed to protect Gulf oil flows. If Gulf states no longer want that protection and instead align with China, American taxpayers are funding bases and capabilities nobody asked for. If you are an oil importer in Europe or Asia, this is an energy security story because the framework that guaranteed Gulf oil exports for 79 years is fracturing. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Suez Crisis of 1956, Britain and France assumed they could control Middle Eastern strategic infrastructure through military force and colonial influence. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France invaded to reassert control. The United States refused to support the operation and forced a withdrawal. British and French influence in the Middle East collapsed overnight. The regional powers realized the old European empires could be defied without catastrophic consequences. The United States is Britain and France. Saudi Arabia is Egypt. The Persian Gulf is the Suez Canal. The parallel is exact, and just as the Suez Crisis marked the end of European colonial dominance in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's denial of U.S. naval passage marks the end of unquestioned American hegemony in the Gulf. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, the United States retaliates economically or militarily to reassert dominance. This could include sanctions, withdrawal of military support, or even limited strikes to demonstrate resolve. The risk is that retaliation drives Saudi Arabia further into China's orbit and accelerates regional realignment against American interests. Likelihood assessment, low, because the costs outweigh the benefits and American credibility is already damaged. Path 2, the United States accepts the new reality and negotiates a reduced military presence in the Gulf in exchange for limited cooperation on counterterrorism and non-interference in Gulf politics. This represents managed decline, where Washington acknowledges it can no longer dictate terms and instead becomes one player among many. Likelihood assessment, increasingly probable as American policymakers confront the limits of leverage. Path 3, regional fragmentation intensifies, with Gulf states forming competing blocs aligned with China, Russia, or local powers, while the United States maintains presence in isolated outposts like Bahrain but loses broader influence. This path leads to a multipolar Middle East where no single external power dominates and regional conflicts become more unpredictable. Likelihood assessment, the most likely long-term outcome if current trends continue. I think we are closer to path 2, transitioning into path 3, than American officials are willing to admit publicly. The infrastructure of American dominance, built over 79 years, is eroding faster than replacement strategies can be implemented. And Saudi Arabia's decision to block U.S. warships is not an isolated incident. It is a signal that the era of American primacy in the Gulf is ending. Here are the questions I want you to take away. How does the United States maintain credible deterrence in the Middle East when its most important partner refuses cooperation? What does Saudi Iranian normalization mean for regional proxy conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq? And most critically, if China has successfully replaced the United States as Saudi Arabia's preferred security partner, what other alliances are vulnerable to similar realignment? Tell me in the comments what you think the United States should do next. Tell me if you believe American influence in the Gulf can be restored or if this represents an irreversible shift. We will keep tracking every development across the Gulf Cooperation Council and the broader reconfiguration of Middle Eastern alliances. That is what this channel does every single day. Subscribe now, share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand the collapse of American hegemony in the Middle East. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next analysis.